Hi everyone, my name is Anupam, and in this video we'll talk about HashiCorp configuration language, Terraform providers, and some important Terraform blocks like resource block, provider block, etc. to understand Terraform configuration language. So let's get started. So what is HashiCorp configuration language? So HashiCorp configuration language is a configuration language authored by HashiCorp. It was designed to be used by HashiCorp tools, specifically Terraform. It has a more clearly visible and defined structure when compared to other configuration language like YAML or JSON. The syntax of Terraform language is defined in terms of this HashiCorp configuration language. What you have to note here is that it is not necessary to know all the aspects or all the details of that HashiCorp configuration language in order to use Terraform. Terraform language will be used to write Terraform code files, also known as configuration files. So you'll notice that I'll call the Terraform code as configuration files. Terraform expects the Terraform code files written in native syntax of that Terraform language to be ended with .tf suffix. That means .tf extension is required for Terraform configuration files. Now what all things you can write using the native syntax, you can also write all those configuration files using the JSON based syntax as well, but that is a bit hard to understand, so people typically not use that syntax in order to write Terraform code. People typically prefer to write Terraform code in the native syntax. That is a bit easy. Now let's talk about Terraform language syntax. Terraform language syntax is built around two key constructs, arguments and blocks. What are arguments? Arguments basically assigns a particular value, say A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. In this case, is being assigned to a particular name, image underscore ID. Now what are blocks? Blocks are basically containers that basically contains other content. A block has a type, and then a block can have 0 labels, 1 label, or more than 1 label. The block body is basically delimited by, or you can say separated by, curly braces. Inside curly braces there could be multiple argument, and it is also possible that inside a block there are blocks available. That is also possible. Now in this example, if you notice that I mentioned that identifier equals to expression, right? So identifier is basically a name. And what are expression? Expression can be any literal value or or another value, or you can reference certain other values, or you can combine multiple values. Anything that will generate a value can be called as expression. Now let's talk about identifiers. Identifiers, as I already said, are the names. So basically argument name, block names, etc. are called identifiers. There are certain rules to use identifiers. So for example, identifiers can only contains letter, digits, underscore and hyphens. And second is, the first character of an identifier must not be a digit to avoid any ambiguity with the literal number. So for example, you are writing a variable name, so you cannot use a variable name that will start with a digit. So this is a constraint that's been applied on identifiers naming. Now talking about the comments in Terraform language. So if you want to use single line comments, then you can use hashtag symbol or double forward slash symbol. If you want to use multi-line comments, then Terraform language says that you have to start the comment with forward slash star, and then you have to write the comment, and then you can close that comment using star and forward slash. So what is Terraform block? So Terraform block is a Terraform configuration block that is used to configure settings related to Terraform. So what all settings that you can configure using Terraform blocks? These are the three settings. So for example, the first one is, if you want to specify the required Terraform version, you have to use required version argument under Terraform block. So in this example, if you see that I mentioned required version of Terraform should be 1.5.0. So basically I have applied a configuration for my Terraform code that okay, my Terraform code will only execute for this particular Terraform version. Now second thing is that if you can also provide the provider requirement using required provider block. So say for example, I want to deploy resources in Google Cloud Platform, then I need a provider to interact with Google Cloud Platform. We'll see in detail about providers in next slide. So here Since I'm using Google Cloud Provider, so I'll mention a local name. So here the local name is Google, and then from which source that provider would be downloaded, and then what version of that provider would be downloaded. So that's how basically I can mention the required provider. So this is one provider. So say if you want to use multiple provider, say you rather Google Cloud Provider, you want to use some other providers like random provider or any other provider that is basically available in Terraform public registry. So you can mention that. Now third thing is that you can also configure a backend under Terraform Block. Backend we'll see in detail when we learn about backends. Now let's talk about providers. What are providers? So basically Terraform makes an API call to the respective cloud provider or the services which are supported by Terraform. So that's how basically Terraform works. So Terraform basically makes an API call to the cloud provider or the services that are being supported by Terraform. Now that Terraform provider is itself a binary. So how that binary is downloaded? You don't need to download that binary, right? So when you for the very first time when you execute Terraform init command, that all those Terraform providers binary would be downloaded automatically. You don't need to worry about that. Now let's talk about the provider block. Some provider require you to configure them certain settings like cloud regions and other things before Terraform can use them. So provider block is basically used for the provider configuration. Since we are using Google Cloud Platform to learn this Terraform, so we have used Google Provider in our previous example. Now, it is not necessary to define these properties like project, region, zone, etc. for the Google Provider, but if you are mentioning, that's also fine. So what will happen? So say you have mentioned these default values for the provider. So say you are deploying a particular resource that needs region, but if you haven't provided the region for that particular resource, then the default region would be used for that resource would be picked from this particular setting. Now let's talk about the resource block. So resources are the most important element in the Terraform language. Each resource block describes one or more infrastructure object, for example network, compute instance, etc. Now in this example, if you notice that I'm using Google Compute Network resource type, right? So say if I want to deploy a VPC network on Google Cloud Platform, then I'll use this resource type. And then what all arguments are supported, I need to check the documentation for that. Every Terraform provider has its own documentation in which they mention that what all resource types are available, what all arguments are supported for that particular resource type. So say once I've deployed that compute network on Google Cloud Platform, now I want to access the particular attribute or particular property of that VPC network. So how can I access? In order to access a particular attribute, I have to use this format, resource type dot resource name dot attribute. So in this case, the format would be Google Compute Network dot test VPC dot ID. So say for example, I want to access the ID of this VPC. So that's how I can access the ID of the VPC. So that's it for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one.